When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had finally found the perfect place to settle down. The houses were neat, the lawns well kept, and the community seemed peaceful. After years of apartment living, I had finally saved enough to buy a home with a yard big enough for one of my long-time dreams, raising a small flock of backyard chickens. Not a farm, not a nuisance, just a modest coop tucked in the back corner of my property. I envisioned fresh eggs in the morning, the gentle clucking of hens, and the simple satisfaction of taking care of them. At first, everything went exactly as planned. I built a coop that was sturdy, secure, and far from the fence line, making sure not to disturb my neighbors. I followed all the local ordinances to the letter. Our city allowed backyard hens as long as they were not roosters, and I made sure I had only 6 hens. No crowing, no disruption. The coop was kept clean, the smell controlled, and the hens themselves were quiet compared to the dogs that barked at all hours down the street. For the first few weeks, no one seemed to mind. In fact, some of my neighbors stopped by to ask about them, curious about how it all worked. Some even joked about putting in orders for eggs. But there's always one person who doesn't like to see others enjoying themselves, and in my neighborhood, that person was a woman named Karen. Karen lived directly behind me. Her house loomed just high enough that she could peek into my backyard from her upstairs window. From the moment I moved in, she gave off an air of entitlement. Her yard was perfectly manicured, not a blade of grass out of place, and she treated the HOA like her personal kingdom. She wasn't officially on the board, but everyone knew she pulled the strings behind the scenes. If she complained, the board listened. The first sign of trouble came when I noticed her glaring over the fence one morning as I scattered feed for the hens. At first I brushed it off. Some people just stare, I told myself. But then came the HOA letter. The letter was neatly typed and full of legal-sounding phrases. It accused me of violating community standards by keeping livestock on my property. It demanded that I remove the chickens immediately or face daily fines. I knew the rules better than that. I had checked before building the coop. So, I wrote a polite response citing the city ordinance that clearly allowed hens within city limits and reminded them that my co-op met every requirement. For a moment, I thought that would be the end of it. But then, another letter arrived. This one was harsher, threatening escalating fines and legal action. Clearly, Karen was not going to let this go. She had decided the chickens were her personal crusade, and she wasn't stopping until she got her way. Still, I refused to give in. The hens were quiet, healthy, and well cared for. There was no legitimate reason to remove them. Neighbors on either side of me had no complaints, and some even defended me at HOA meetings. But Karen's voice was the loudest, and she wasn't afraid to make a scene. Her campaign escalated quickly. She began calling animal control on me, reporting noise complaints and unsanitary conditions. Each time the officers would come by, inspect the coop, and leave without incident. They even complimented how clean everything was. But Karen didn't stop. She started spreading rumors around the neighborhood, claims that my chickens carried diseases, that they attracted rats, that the smell lowered property values. I began to feel the pressure. Every time I stepped outside, I felt her eyes on me from that upstairs window. Every time I drove home, I saw her glaring as she watered her lawn. And every week, another letter from the HOA showed up in my mailbox. It was exhausting, but I stayed firm. Then came the day I realized this wasn't just about chickens anymore. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when I was out back cleaning the coop. As I worked, I noticed the hens scratching along the fence line, pecking at the ground as they loved to do. Suddenly, they became fixated on one particular spot near the base of the fence. At first, I thought nothing of it. They often chased bugs and dug little holes in the dirt, but this time they wouldn't stop. They scratched and pecked furiously, clucking with excitement. Curious, I set down my rake and walked over. That's when I saw it. A small gap beneath the fence, just wide enough to reveal something hidden on Karen's side. The chickens had uncovered a trail of what looked like discarded food scraps and strange debris spilling through to my yard. The smell was faint but sour, nothing like the clean soil I was used to maintaining. I crouched down for a better look and realized it wasn't just a stray piece of garbage. The ground was littered with what appeared to be rotting leftovers, plastic containers, and even a few empty bottles. It looked like someone had been dumping trash in that hidden corner for a long time. My stomach turned. Karen, the woman who complained endlessly about my unsanitary chickens, had a secret mess of her own hidden behind her pristine yard. And now my hens had stumbled right onto it. At first, I wasn't sure what to do. I covered the gap as best I could, but the discovery stayed on my mind all night. I couldn't shake the irony. Karen, the self-proclaimed guardian of property values, might be harboring something far worse than a few harmless chickens. And if the rest of the neighborhood found out, her carefully curated reputation would crumble. The hens had revealed something Karen never wanted anyone to see, and I had the sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. The image of that hidden mess behind Karen's fence refused to leave my mind. All evening, as I cooked dinner and tried to relax, I kept replaying what I had seen. The sour smell, the scattered trash, the strange scraps my chickens had unearthed. It didn't add up. Karen's yard had always been immaculate, almost unnaturally so. Her flower beds were trimmed like a magazine cover, her lawn was lush, and her hedges looked sculpted by a professional. To anyone passing by, it screamed perfection. Yet, behind that carefully constructed image, something ugly was festering. The next morning, my hens returned to the fence line, as though they sensed there was more to uncover. Chickens are naturally curious creatures, and when they find something interesting, they don't forget it. They scratched at the soil again, sending up little puffs of dust as their claws worked furiously. I let them go about their business, partly amused and partly uneasy. And sure enough, within minutes, they had pulled loose another bit of debris. This time, it was the corner of a greasy paper bag that had been wedged under the fence. When I picked it up, my hands came away sticky. Inside were old fast food wrappers and a crumpled cup that reeked of soda long gone sour. The trash was weeks, maybe months old. My frustration boiled. Karen had been accusing me of creating filth with my chickens, but the evidence was pointing in the opposite direction. I walked around the block that afternoon, casually glancing at the backside of her property from the alleyway that ran behind our houses. From the street-facing side, everything still looked pristine. But as I drew closer, I noticed that one section of her privacy fence bowed slightly inward, as though something heavy had been stacked against it. The wood was discolored at the base, darkened by moisture, and small flies hovered in the air around it. I realized then that my chickens hadn't just stumbled on a stray bit of garbage. Karen was dumping trash behind her fence. And not just a little, enough to rot, to attract insects, and to leave a stench that was now seeping through into my yard. The hypocrisy was staggering. Here was a woman who had weaponized the HOA, filing complaint after complaint against my well-kept, lawful chicken coop, while secretly hiding her own violation of community standards. But exposing her wouldn't be easy. Karen wasn't just a loud voice. She was manipulative, the type who twisted every situation to her advantage. If I accused her outright, she'd deny it. She'd claim the trash wasn't hers, or worse, that I had planted it there to discredit her. I needed proof, undeniable proof, and ironically, my chickens seemed determined to help me find it. As the days passed, their scratching unearthed more pieces of Karen's hidden dump. Plastic lids, stained napkins, and even an empty wine bottle that rolled onto my side of the yard. Each discovery added weight to my suspicion. What exactly was she trying to hide? And why, if she cared so much about appearances, would she create a hidden garbage heap so close to her own property line? The irony was not lost on me. Karen had accused me of lowering property values with my hens, yet if the HOA discovered her trash pile, it could result in hefty fines, not to mention public humiliation. I considered calling code enforcement immediately, but something stopped me. It wasn't just about reporting her, it was about strategy. Karen had declared war on my chickens, and if I struck back too soon, she'd twist the narrative. I had to be patient. One evening, while closing the coop, I noticed the hens acting unusually excited near the fence again. Their clucking was loud, insistent, almost frantic. When I approached, I saw why. They had scratched away enough dirt to uncover the edge of a black plastic bag. The bag was torn, and a foul odor leaked from it, worse than anything I'd smelled before. I grabbed a pair of gloves and carefully tugged it free. Inside was not just food waste, but something more unsettling. Empty pill bottles, crumpled receipts, and containers that looked medical in nature. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just casual laziness or someone too busy to take out the trash. This was deliberate. Karen was hiding something behind that fence, and it wasn't just about fast food wrappers. The receipts caught my eye. They were damp but legible, dated only a few weeks prior. They were from a nearby pharmacy, tied to purchases of strong prescription medications. I couldn't see a name on them, but I tucked the bag away, my mind racing. Why would Karen dispose of something like this in secret? Why not simply put it in the trash bin like everyone else? As I lay awake that night, the pieces began to connect. Karen wasn't just a control freak neighbor with too much time on her hands. She was hiding something personal, something she didn't want the neighborhood or the HOA she manipulated to discover. And if my hens had unearthed this much already, there was no telling what else lay beneath that fence. But with discovery came danger. If Karen realized that my chickens were exposing her secret, she wouldn't just complain louder, she'd strike harder. She had already pushed the HOA to the edge of harassment over my hens. If she felt threatened, she might escalate beyond letters and meetings. Still, I couldn't ignore the irony. My chickens, the very animals she despised and tried to destroy me over, had become the key to revealing her hidden life. Their persistence at the fence was uncovering the truth one clawful of dirt at a time. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before Karen realized that too. The stage was set for a battle that went far beyond chickens and property lines. The question now wasn't whether I could keep my hens, it was whether Karen's secret would come crashing down around her before she managed to take me with it. And as fate would have it, the answer came sooner than I expected, because one morning, as I sipped my coffee on the porch, I saw Karen storming across her backyard, her eyes locked on my coop. She wasn't glaring this time. She looked panicked, desperate, as if she knew the chickens were digging closer to something she couldn't afford to lose. The sight of Karen storming across her backyard that morning was unlike anything I had seen before. Normally, she carried herself with smug confidence, chin high, lips pursed in superiority, as though she were above everyone else in the neighborhood. But this time was different. Her movements were hurried, jerky, and frantic. She clutched a pair of heavy gloves in one hand and a shovel in the other, and her eyes darted nervously around as if checking to see if anyone was watching. From my porch, I pretended to sip my coffee, keeping my gaze fixed on my newspaper. But my ears were tuned to every sound, and my peripheral vision caught her every movement. She went straight to the section of fence where my chickens had been scratching for days, the very spot where they had unearthed her hidden bags of trash. Karen crouched down and began clawing at the dirt with her shovel, scooping soil back into the gap the hens had exposed. She worked furiously, piling the dirt higher and higher, as though she believed she could bury the evidence deep enough to erase it forever. Sweat dripped down her forehead, even though the morning air was still cool, but the problem with secrets is that once they begin to surface, burying them again only makes the pile bigger. The chickens had already dragged pieces into my yard, and I had already collected them. No amount of frantic shoveling could undo that. For a brief moment, Karen froze and glanced up at my house. I kept my head lowered, pretending to flip a page in the paper. She lingered there, suspicious, then turned back and pressed her weight against the soil, compacting it with her gloved hands. When she finished, she pulled a large plastic tarp from behind her shed and stretched it along the inside of her fence, pinning it down with bricks. She was building a wall, not of wood or stone, but of lies and desperation. The irony made my stomach churn. Here was the woman who had spent weeks accusing me of lowering property values with my dirty livestock, now on her knees in the mud, scrambling to conceal her own filth. Later that afternoon, the HOA sent me yet another letter. This one was more aggressive than the last. It claimed that multiple concerned neighbors had complained about noise, odor, and health risks from my chickens. It demanded immediate removal of the hens and threatened a lien on my property if I didn't comply. I knew who was behind it. Karen was tightening the screws, sensing that her own world might unravel. Her panic had turned into aggression, and she was determined to crush me before I had the chance to fight back. But what she didn't realize was that I was no longer just defending chickens. I was holding on to evidence. The greasy bags, the pill bottles, the receipts, they were all stored safely in my shed, tucked away in a box labeled plainly enough that no one would think twice if they stumbled upon it. Proof that Karen was a hypocrite and possibly something much worse. The following week, Karen escalated her campaign. She marched door to door, knocking on neighbors' homes and rallying them against me. I could hear her shrill voice carrying down the street, describing me as a reckless, selfish homeowner who didn't care about community standards. She claimed my chickens would bring disease, that their droppings would poison the soil, that rats would overrun the neighborhood. Some neighbors seemed skeptical. Others, eager to avoid conflict, nodded politely. A few even began giving me colder looks when I passed them on my evening walks. Karen was good at this. She thrived on control, twisting reality until people questioned their own judgment. But while she tried to bury her secrets in the dirt, my chickens had other plans. Every morning, they returned to the fence with relentless curiosity. The tarp Karen had pinned down did little to stop them. They scratched and clawed at the edges, pulling loose corners, pecking at weak spots until more debris slipped through. It was as if they knew there was something important buried there, something the world needed to see. One afternoon, I came outside to find the hens circling excitedly around a new object. At first glance, it looked like another crumpled plastic bag. But when I picked it up, my stomach tightened. It wasn't trash this time. It was a folder, water-damaged, but still intact, its edges smeared with dirt. Inside were several documents, some stamped with official seals, others handwritten. The first page I unfolded made my pulse race. It was a notice of delinquent payments. Karen, the queen of HOA complaints, was months behind on her own property taxes. The second page was even more damning, a letter from a collections agency demanding repayment of a large sum tied to what looked like medical expenses. And then there was a crumpled sheet that appeared to be a notice of code violation from years prior, citing improper waste disposal on her property. She hadn't just started dumping trash behind her fence. She had been doing it for a long time. The chickens hadn't just uncovered garbage. They had exposed Karen's entire house of cards. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, I sat in my backyard and thought about my next move. I had enough evidence to take to the HOA board, enough to turn the tables and force Karen into silence. But part of me hesitated. Karen wasn't just an enemy. She was dangerous. If I revealed her secret too soon, she would retaliate with everything she had. I needed to time it right, to let her dig her own grave a little deeper before I lowered the final shovel of dirt. My patience was rewarded sooner than expected. The very next morning, the HOA held a surprise inspection of my property. 3 board members marched into my yard without warning, clipboards in hand, taking notes on my chicken coop, my lawn, even the condition of my siding. Karen stood behind them, arms folded smugly, her lips curled into a satisfied smile. She thought she had me cornered. She thought this inspection would be the end of my chickens, the final nail in the coffin of her campaign against me. But what she didn't know was that the chickens were still scratching, still digging, and with every clawful of dirt they unearthed, they were pulling her secret closer to the surface, and soon she wouldn't be able to bury it again. The HOA inspection began with the stiff politeness of people convinced they were doing something important. The 3 board members clipped their pens against their clipboards as they circled my yard, their eyes darting from the coop to the grass, from the flower beds to the side of the house. Their questions came in sharp bursts. How many hens did I have? How often did I clean the coop? What kind of feed was I using? I answered calmly, even cheerfully. Every answer was supported by city ordinance, every detail in full compliance with the law. The hens clucked softly in the background, scratching at the soil, oblivious to the supposed seriousness of the scene. Karen, of course, hovered just beyond the group, her smirk stretching wider with every passing moment. She was certain that today was the day I'd be cornered, fined, and humiliated. She even had her phone out, recording clips as though preparing for some dramatic takedown she could share with the neighborhood, but the board members didn't seem impressed. They inspected the coop and found it spotless, with fresh bedding, sealed feed containers, and no sign of pests. They sniffed the air and admitted, reluctantly, that there was no smell. One of them even remarked that my yard was better kept than most. Karen's smile faltered, but she wasn't finished. She urged them toward the fence line, insisting that the real problem was hidden there. With a sweep of her hand, she declared that my chickens were scratching up filth and that the stench was proof of their danger to the community. The irony struck me hard enough to make me bite my lip to keep from laughing. Because as the board members approached the fence, the hens clucked excitedly and darted to the same corner they always loved, the corner where Karen's secrets lay buried. They scratched and pecked, flinging loose soil into the air, until one claw hooked under the edge of the tarp Karen had so carefully pinned down. With a single tug, it peeled back just enough to reveal the blackened corner of another trash bag beneath. The smell hit first, a sour, rotting odor that drifted up like a warning. The board members recoiled, covering their noses, and one muttered something about unsanitary conditions. Karen's face drained of color. She rushed forward, waving her hands, insisting the smell was from my coop, that my chickens were the problem. But the evidence betrayed her. The smell was coming from her side of the fence, not mine. One of the board members crouched down, peering closer, and frowned. He pointed out that the soil was discolored, damp in patches that suggested long-term dumping. Another scribbled notes furiously on her clipboard. Karen grew louder, her excuses tumbling over one another, but her panic only made her guilt more obvious. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, I saw doubt flicker in the eyes of the HOA board. Their loyalty to Karen had always been strong, but the chickens had forced them to see what she had hidden. They wrapped up their inspection quickly, promising to review the findings and send a formal notice. Karen trailed after them, shrill and desperate, trying to twist the narrative back in her favor. But the damage was done. That night, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Word of the inspection spread fast. Some neighbors approached me quietly, asking if it was true that the chickens had uncovered garbage behind Karen's yard. I didn't deny it, but I didn't need to say much. The smell alone, drifting faintly on the breeze, spoke for itself. Karen, however, doubled down. She spent the next few days plastering the community bulletin boards with flyers accusing me of harassment, of fabricating evidence to frame her. She claimed my chickens were a menace and that I was orchestrating a smear campaign against her. But her shrill denials only fueled more suspicion. The neighbors had seen enough of her antics to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the chickens weren't the problem after all. Meanwhile, the hens continued their relentless work. By the end of the week, they had unearthed yet another bag, this one partially torn open. Inside were more incriminating scraps, unopened envelopes from debt collectors, a broken electronic device, and yet more rotting food. I carefully collected the items and tucked them away with the rest of the evidence. At this point, I had more than enough to take to the HOA board and dismantle Karen's credibility entirely. But I knew she wouldn't go down quietly. She thrived on drama, and if I moved too soon, she'd find a way to twist the story. So I decided to wait for the right moment. The moment when she would try to strike hardest, only for her own secrets to explode back in her face. That moment arrived faster than I expected. The HOA scheduled an emergency community meeting called under the pretense of addressing persistent property violations. It was thinly veiled code for me and my chickens. Karen had clearly pushed for it, hoping to rally the neighborhood once more and force the board into taking official action. I walked into the meeting hall that evening with my evidence packed neatly in a folder under my arm. The air buzzed with tension. Neighbors filled the seats, murmuring among themselves, while Karen stood at the front, already lecturing anyone who would listen about the horrors of backyard poultry. She spotted me entering and narrowed her eyes, her lips curling into a triumphant sneer. She thought she had won. The board opened the meeting with a dry recitation of complaints, most of them written in Karen's unmistakable phrasing. She seized the floor at every opportunity, raising her voice, pointing at me, accusing me of destroying the neighborhood's peace and dragging down property values. Her words echoed through the room, sharp and cutting, but beneath the surface, I saw something else. Her desperation, her fear that her carefully maintained mask was about to crack. And then, at the peak of her rant, one of my hens made herself heard. From outside the hall, since I had left the coop open before arriving, the faint but distinct clucking of my chickens drifted into the silence. Some neighbors chuckled softly, amused at the timing. But to me, it felt like a signal. The chickens had carried me this far, scratching at lies until the truth surfaced. Now it was my turn to speak. I rose slowly, folder in hand, and felt the weight of every eye in the room shift toward me. Karen's glare sharpened, but there was a flicker of unease in her expression. She knew I had something. She just didn't know how much. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The room was tense as I stood, folder in hand, while every neighbor's eyes fixed on me. The HOA board sat stiffly at the front table, their pens hovering over papers, unsure whether to welcome or silence me. Karen, standing to one side, was practically vibrating with fury, her arms folded, her eyes locked on me like daggers. She believed this was her stage, her grand moment to eliminate the chicken menace once and for all. I didn't raise my voice when I began. Instead, I let it fall calm, steady, deliberate. I reminded the room that city ordinances permitted backyard hens, provided no roosters were kept. I reminded them that my coop had been inspected multiple times by animal control, always without incident, always declared clean and compliant. The murmurs from the crowd grew as people nodded, realizing they had never actually seen or smelled any problem from my yard. Karen interrupted, her voice shrill, insisting that I was lying, that I was manipulating the law to skirt community standards. But the board motioned for her to wait. For once, they wanted to hear me out. And that's when I opened the folder. The first document I placed on the table was a copy of the city ordinance itself, highlighted where it specifically permitted hens. The board members leaned in, their eyes scanning the text, their pens scribbling notes. Karen shifted uneasily. The second item was a series of photographs I had taken, not of my coop, but of what my chickens had unearthed from beneath her fence. Bags torn open, the contents spilling across the soil, Greasy wrappers, empty bottles, rotting food. I had been careful to capture the smell in words, noting the date and time of each discovery. The board leaned back, noses wrinkling as though they could already imagine the odor. Murmurs rippled through the room. Karen's composure cracked. She stormed toward the table, demanding the photos be removed, accusing me of staging them, of planting trash near her yard. Her voice rose higher, shriller, desperate. But I wasn't finished. The third set of evidence silenced the room. Envelopes, receipts, and official notices. Items my hens had dragged out one clawful at a time. A collections letter demanding repayment. A tax notice showing delinquency. A code violation citing improper waste disposal. I laid them out in a neat row, each piece another nail in the coffin of her credibility. Gasps echoed across the room. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering to one another. The HOA board members looked at one another uneasily. And Karen? She froze. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her face turned pale, then red, then pale again. A storm of humiliation crashing across her features. For a moment, silence filled the hall. Then, one by one, voices began to rise. People who had believed her lies were now questioning everything. If she had been hiding trash and debt and violations, what else had she been lying about? Some neighbors who had once nodded politely at her tirades now turned their eyes away, unwilling to meet her gaze. Others glared openly, angry at how she had manipulated them. Karen finally found her voice, but it was trembling, unsteady. She accused me again of planting the evidence, of fabricating everything to smear her reputation. She shouted that I was dangerous, that I was out to destroy the neighborhood, but her words fell flat. The more she spoke, the more unhinged she sounded. The board chair cleared his throat, his tone measured but firm. He reminded Karen that she had initiated countless complaints against me, all of which had been dismissed by animal control. He reminded her that the HOA had wasted weeks chasing baseless accusations, while real violations, it seemed, were being hidden behind her own fence. He announced that an investigation would be launched, not into my chickens, but into Karen's property. The room erupted. Some neighbors applauded. Others laughed quietly at the bitter irony. Karen's face twisted with rage as she realized the tide had turned. The authority she had once wielded like a weapon was slipping through her fingers. She tried one last desperate move. She accused the board of conspiring against her, claimed that I had bribed them, even hinted that neighbors were plotting together to force her out. But the more she spoke, the deeper she dug her hole. People began shaking their heads, exchanging looks of disbelief. Her paranoia was on full display, and there was no way to hide it now. I remained silent through her meltdown. I didn't need to argue anymore. The evidence spoke louder than her words ever could. My chickens had unearthed her secrets, piece by piece, until her perfect facade crumbled in front of everyone. By the time the meeting adjourned, the decision was clear. The HOA would not be pursuing me or my chickens. Instead, they would be investigating Karen's waste disposal, her unpaid dues, and her compliance with community standards. Karen stormed out before the meeting ended, slamming the door so hard the walls rattled. I walked home slowly, the weight of months of tension finally lifting from my shoulders. My hens greeted me at the gate, clucking softly as though they knew what they had done. They weren't just chickens anymore. They were my unlikely allies, the ones who had dug up the truth when no one else could. That night, I sat on my porch and listened to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. For the first time in months, it felt peaceful. The air was free of Karen's shrill complaints. The weight of her constant surveillance lifted. The chickens scratched, contentedly in the dirt, unaware of the storm they had survived. But even as I enjoyed the calm, I knew the battle wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She had lost her standing, her credibility, and perhaps even her grip on the HOA. But people like her didn't fade quietly into the background. She would come back, angrier than ever, desperate to reclaim the control she had lost. And when she did, I would be ready. The days following the HOA meeting were strangely quiet. For the first time since I had moved in, I could walk into my backyard without feeling eyes burning into me from an upstairs window. The barrage of letters stopped. The hushed gossip in the neighborhood softened. My chickens clucked and scratched happily in their coop, unaware that they had just played a part in dismantling the reign of the neighborhood's self-appointed queen. But silence, I knew, was not surrender. Karen had been humiliated, exposed. in front of the very people she had spent years manipulating. Her spotless reputation was tarnished, her authority in question, and her control over the HOA slipping from her grasp. People like Karen didn't simply lick their wounds and move on. They plotted, they schemed, they came back sharper, more desperate, and more dangerous. And it wasn't long before she struck again. It started with small things. A tipped-over trash can near my driveway. Deep scratches on the side of my mailbox that hadn't been there before. Flyers pulled from my door and tossed into the street. Petty inconveniences, nothing I could prove, but enough to make me suspicious. Then came the letter. Not from the HOA this time, but shoved crudely into my mailbox, unsigned, its words scrawled in messy handwriting. It accused me of being a fraud, of poisoning the neighborhood with lies, of turning people against their true leader. It warned me that people like me didn't belong here, and that if I didn't get rid of my chickens, I'd regret it. I didn't need a signature to know who had written it. At first, I thought about ignoring it. After all, the HOA was investigating her now, and the neighbors were already wary of her. But the tone of that letter, it wasn't just petty anymore. It was threatening. And I realized then that Karen's desperation had reached a breaking point. That breaking point came one night, not long after. I was inside finishing dinner when I heard the commotion, panicked clucking, frantic flapping, the unmistakable sound of my chickens in distress. I bolted out the back door and rushed toward the coop. The night air was cool, the moon casting pale light across the yard. And there, near the coop, I caught sight of a figure. Dark clothing, crouched low, fumbling with the latch on the gate. Karen, I froze, disbelief crashing into anger. She wasn't content with complaints or letters anymore. She was in my yard in the middle of the night, trying to get at my hens. Whether she meant to harm them, release them, or simply cause chaos, I didn't know. But the sight of her there confirmed everything. She had lost all sense of restraint. The chickens reacted before I could. Their flapping grew frantic, wings beating against the coop, claws raking at the dirt. The noise was deafening, a chorus of panic that carried through the still night air. Lights flicked on in neighboring houses. Curtains rustled as people peeked out. And Karen, realizing she had been caught in the spotlight of her own making, panicked. She stumbled backward, tripping over the uneven ground, her arms flailing. The tarp she had used to hide her trash heap weeks before had loosened under the chicken's relentless scratching, and in her scramble, she fell straight into it. The soil gave way, and with it came the stench of rot, bags splitting open, debris spilling into the open. The sight was grotesque and undeniable. Karen, the woman who had preached endlessly about cleanliness and standards, sprawled in the very pit of filth she had tried to bury. Empty bottles clinked as they rolled, greasy wrappers clung to her clothes, and the sour stench clung to her like a brand. By now, neighbors had poured into their backyards, drawn by the noise. Phones lit up the night as people recorded what they saw. Whispers turned to laughter, laughter to open mockery. Karen staggered to her feet, trying to brush herself clean. But every movement only made it worse. Her perfect image was gone, shattered in the glow of cell phone screens. The HOA's investigation had already put her under scrutiny. But this was the final straw. Not just whispers or documents or photographs, but living proof. Witnessed by half the neighborhood of her hypocrisy and her obsession. Karen fled that night, retreating into her house with the curtains drawn tight. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift. The HOA board issued a formal notice citing her violations, including improper waste disposal, harassment, and trespassing. Neighbors who had once supported her turned away in disgust. Some even shared the videos online, where they spread faster than she could contain them. Her reputation, once polished and commanding, was now little more than a punchline. She was no longer the self-appointed enforcer of standards. She was the woman who drowned in her own garbage while trying to sabotage a neighbor's chicken coop. And, as for me, the HOA not only cleared me of every accusation, but formally acknowledged that my hens were in compliance. They even apologized, something I never thought I'd hear from a board that had been under Karen's thumb. Life in the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. My chickens thrived, laying eggs daily, their soft clucking a gentle reminder of everything they had survived. Neighbors stopped by, some sheepishly admitting they had believed Karen's lies, others congratulating me for standing my ground. As for Karen, she retreated into silence. Her yard, once the envy of the block, grew neglected. Weeds sprouted where there had once been perfect hedges, and the shutters stayed closed. She became a ghost of the woman she had tried to project, living in the shadow of her own downfall. And every morning, as I scattered feed for the hens, I couldn't help but smile. They had been the beginning of the battle and the key to its victory. It wasn't my arguments, my patience, or even the evidence I had collected that truly destroyed Karen. It was the chickens. Relentless, curious, and honest in their persistence. They had scratched and clawed until the truth came to light, exposing what no one else could see. Karen had hated my backyard chickens, but in the end, it was those very chickens that exposed her secret, unraveled her power, and left her with nothing but the mess she had tried so hard to bury. And I couldn't imagine a sweeter revenge.